After Effects rigs, like this one, are built using expressions. This tutorial comes from our Advanced Motion Methods course, and in it, Nol Honig and Zack Lovatt will teach you how to use expressions to build flexible rigs, plus some more advanced tricks you can start using right away. Let's geek out.
I know you're all really eager to get going, so let's jump right into After Effects. I do want to jump in and talk about expression controls, which some of you might know about, but others might not, and they will definitely help out when dealing with the big rig that we've set up for the end of this tutorial, okay? And also, expression controls are awesome. I love them. They're really great for people like me who aren't necessarily really good at coding because they allow you to just kind of click and drag and the code is written for you essentially. So it's a lot easier in many cases, all right? So let's talk about expression controls. What I've done here is I've set up a little comp with an orange square and a blue square and a controller, which I've made a guide layer that is just a null object, okay? So if I select this and I go up to Effect, you see that there are all these expression controls up here. You've probably played around with some of these. The ones that I want to talk about today, which I find most useful in my own workflow, though I use all of them, I'm going to talk about angle control, checkbox control, and slider control, okay? I'm going to start with angle control. I think that's the easiest to comprehend. Right on, so when I click this on, I get this kind of familiar looking angle control, right? And I can call this like square rotation or whatever. Just make it easier to understand what this is for, okay? So now obviously if I want to link, actually, I lied. I'm going to take this and I'm going to lock it up here so that this effect control panel stays there, okay? So I'm going to take these and now I'm going to press R to reveal the rotation property. And it's very simple to affect these squares' rotation using this angle control, okay? All I would have to do is Option or Alt, if you're on a PC, click on the rotation and then pick whip up here to the angle control. I think you all know how to do this probably. But just in case it's not clear, now when I roll this angle control, this square rotates, right? And I can do the same thing for the blue square. I can Option or Alt click on this and now move over to this angle control and now both will work through this one control, okay? But actually what I want to do in this exercise is show how I can set things up, for example, so that the squares rotate in opposite directions, which is slightly more complicated, but not actually that hard. Because in this case, all I would have to do is just choose one of the squares or the other, and then get in here in the code and then just type times -1, okay? And now I believe they would twirl oppositely, yes, which is really fun and cool. And just in case it isn't totally clear, let me just explain the math that's going on underneath the hood here. Okay, so if I set my square rotation to 61, for example, then down here, my orange square's rotation is at 61, as you'd expect. And the blue square is at -61. And the reason why that is because of this code in here in which I have multiplied it by -1, okay? It takes all the values from the control and makes them essentially the same, but just negative, right? So that's how that works mathematically. And I just want to say, I'm sure this is obvious to all of you, but at the heart of using expressions and slider controls is what's known as rigging in After Effects, okay? Which is to say, that you create a situation where one layer pretty much controls the animation for a ton of other layers, okay? So let's take this to the next level and add a slider control here onto the control, okay? So I'm gonna go up to Effect, Expression Controls, and Slider Control, and I'm gonna call this my Scale Slider. And for obvious reasons, which is that I'm going to use it to affect the scale of these two squares. So let me choose these two and press S, okay, to reveal the scale property. Now, when dealing with scale, you have two dimensions, as you know, I believe, because scale is written as the X and Y scale, or the horizontal and vertical scaling of this. Even if you uncheck this, you can't separate the dimensions like you can with position, okay? So we're gonna need to use a little bit more coding to get this right, okay? So here we go. I'm going to Alt or Options click on the stopwatch to make my expression. Now I'm gonna define some variables. So let me first just explain what a variable is really quickly, because it's actually a super important thing to understand about After Effects expressions. So technically, a variable is anything in the code that can vary, which is totally not helpful. So let me explain it this other way, all right? Technically, a variable can be thought of as a named container that holds data. Hopefully that's a little bit clearer in terms of what I'm talking about. But, let me just say that the main advantage for using variables is that a human being can read them easily if they happen to look at your code, okay? So this is one big advantage, is that if you define your variables well, it's very clear what those variables are, as opposed to just pick whipping to a whole bunch of stuff and not defining variables, okay? So that's one thing, is that they can be read easily by people. The other thing about variables that's great is that they can change, okay? So just say I define a variable as var x. And I should mention, by the way, that in the code, variables get shortened down to var or var, which some people pronounce var, but I pronounce var, okay? So just say I define var x, okay? What I could do is I could set var x to just equal 50, for example, and then that would never change. That value would just hold at 50. But what's much more useful and much more common is if I say var x equals, and then I pick whip to just say a slider control, and then that variable is dependent on the slider control value, okay? So I'm putting data into a container that can then change. So I'm gonna call var x, which is, what I'm gonna use to deal with the x position, x scale values here, okay? Var x equals, and now I'm going to pick whip to this, not this, but this, which is the x scale value, okay? And you can see here with the bracket 0 bracket that means it's dealing with the first dimension, which in this case is the x. It often is in After Effects, okay? Now I'm gonna say plus, and I'm gonna pick whip to the slider control, okay? Now I'm gonna put a semicolon. And if you're new to expressions, let me just point out that you should probably always end every sentence or thought with a semicolon in your code, okay? Not always, but generally speaking, this is the way to go. So for example, if you define var x as whatever, you should put a semicolon in before going on to define the next variable, like var y, for example. Go into the next line, var y equals, okay? And now I'm gonna pick whip to this, plus, and now I'm gonna pick whip to this. It's so easy with all this pick whipping, I'm telling you, okay? And whoops, just type a semicolon there. And just to reiterate, this one refers to, so the 0 refers to the first dimension of scale x, and this 1 refers to the second dimension, which is the y, okay? Hopefully that's totally clear, I'm sure it is. Now I'm going to just say bracket x comma y bracket, okay? And that should, oops, except for I typed ver instead of var. That would have tripped me up, all right? So I'm gonna type that over, great. So now this works just fine. As I slide this up, that gets bigger. And as I slide that down, that gets smaller, okay? So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna right click on scale here and copy expression only. And now I'm going to Command V paste that right here, okay? So now you see when I slide this up, they both get bigger. And when I slide this down, they both get smaller, okay? Which is not what I want. What I want is the opposite direction thing that we talked about before. So in this case, let's look at this code a sec. I'm gonna press EE to reveal my code. And this is really simple. All I have to do is get in here and take the pluses and make them into minuses. And I believe that that should now, yep. And I kind of like this animation, the way they sort of seem to be connected at the corner there, right? So that's really cool. That's a cool little rig. And you could always like animate this and this at the same time. And that would be maybe a dynamic animation for you. Okay, finally, let's talk about checkbox controls, and I want to teach you quickly about the if-else expression, which is super useful and work well together, okay? So I'm going to use it on the opacity of these layers. So I'm going to choose T for my opacity. I'm going to choose my controller and go up here to expression controls, checkbox control, okay? This gives you this little check here, which by the way, for After Effects, when it's checked on, it equals 1. And when it's checked off, it equals 0, basically. So that's the value assigned to the check, okay, which is pretty useful. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna get in here and I'm gonna option click on this. And I'm first gonna define a variable of my checkbox, var c equals this or whatever, right? Okay, good enough. Semicolon. Now I'm gonna do the if-else expression. This is not that complicated. I'm gonna say if, now remember I've defined c as that checkbox. So I'm gonna say if that checkbox is greater than 0, okay, which basically means if it's checked, okay, because you remember checked equals 1, unchecked equals 0. Okay, and I'm going to use some curly brackets here. And I'm going to say 100 and then close the curly bracket. Whoops, that's a regular bracket. Okay. Now I'm going to write else. Okay. And I'm going to go here and I type another curly bracket. And now I'm going to say 0. Okay. And I'm going to go down here and I'm going to close out that curly bracket. Great. So what this means now is, okay, variable C is the checkbox. If the checkbox is checked, the opacity should be 100. Otherwise, it should be 0 right now. And right now it's checked. Okay. So it's on. All right. And if I uncheck this, it's off. Okay. So that's all that does. That's pretty much it. And what I could do is right click and copy expression only and paste this onto the blue. And now obviously they'll both turn off when checked. But if I want to do this the opposite, for example, here, all I would need to do is take the greater than and make that equals, which in JavaScript code equals. Okay. So now if it's equals 0, which means that it's checked off, now that's on, right? Okay. So that's cool. That's how I would do that with the checkbox. And that's an overview of if-else expressions.
So wiggle is probably the most common expression for everyday motion designers in After Effects. It's this handy little function that lets you add a little bit of random movement to anything you'd like. For our purposes, we're going to look at only 2 components of wiggle, frequency and amplitude. Frequency means how often should we generate a new number? So that's how many times a second do we want to change the value that we're looking at? Amplitude, the second value, is how much do we want this value to change? On position, that's like, what is the maximum number of pixels that our layer should move to? For rotation, what is the maximum number of degrees it should spin to, and so on. Using just these 2 parameters, we can get a ton of control over just how random a property gets, both in terms of amplitude, the amount, and frequency, the speed. Let's take a look at what this means. Here, I have a simple circle moving around with wiggle, displaying a path behind it so you can easily see what it's doing. If we jump into the graph editor and enable Show Post Expression Graph using this button, you can see the results of your expression right in the graph editor. You can see that there's a lot of movement here. We're generating a new value 10 times a second. So this is a pretty jittery graph. Let's change the first parameter, frequency, from 10 changes per second down to 2 and see what happens. As you can see, the graph is a lot smoother. There's 1/5 the animation going on here, so the movement is a lot less frantic. If we change the second parameter, amplitude, we're going to get this exact same pattern of movement, but the values will now stretch to fit the new amplitude. Let's look at this in practice. First, a simple circle with a wiggle on the position. With a frequency of 2 and amplitude of 400, we're telling the circle move to a new position within 400 pixels twice a second. If we change the frequency, you can see the animation is a lot slower. The same applies for size. We can randomize the circle's dimensions with the wiggle as well. Almost any property can be wiggled, including things like color. Now, if you're just typing in numbers once and never changing them, this is a fine way to do it. The issue is that if you want to change these values a lot, or you want to add math or do other things with them, it's kind of hard to do just in the space of these little brackets. One way to improve this is to move these values out to variables. This way, you separate the intention of defining the values of these properties and putting the values to use. This has the huge benefit of letting us change them quickly, easily, and even do things like adding math or pick whipping them to other values. Here, I can pick whip our amplitude to opacity, which means that as our layer fades in and out, the layer will wiggle more or less based on that number. Let's take this a step further. What if you wanted to set up a whole bunch of different wiggles, all with the same frequency and amplitude, but then you wanted to go in and change those values? Now, you could just duplicate your layer a bunch of times, and you'll get different wiggles. You can go in and you can edit your frequency, edit your amplitude on each one. But the issue is that this is a lot of work, and if you have a ton of layers, that's going to be really annoying. So another way to do this is, instead of having the values right in your expression, you can have those variables set from expression control sliders. By simply creating some sliders and using the pick whip, you can now have your wiggle controlled by a different layer sliders, which makes it even easier to change, update those values, or apply them to a ton of layers. This works just the same way as if you were typing the numbers yourself, except now you get these little sliders, which makes it so much easier to use. Plus, this has the benefit of being able to duplicate your layer a whole bunch of times, and all of your child layers will now respect those same slider values. So you can now change the frequency and amplitude of all of those layers at the same time without touching the expression ever again. This section is called Learning to Learn. The idea is that while we can't tell you everything about expressions, we want to leave you with a few tips and tricks that'll help you debug or troubleshoot things that you're seeing in your own work. First, I want to show you the expression flyout menu. Now, when you enable expression, you get these little buttons here. The first will toggle your expression on or off. The second will be the post-expression graph, which we went over in Wiggle, and I'll go over in a bit more detail shortly. Third is the pick whip. And the fourth is where the magic happens, the expression language menu. Now, when you click on this, you're going to see a whole bunch of categories, and each one contains a whole bunch of other things. What these are little code snippets or reference points. They're sort of like building blocks. This menu is the Lego bin of components for how to build expressions. Now, with the stuff you're seeing here, sometimes you can use them exactly as is. You can click on it and it's good to go. Other ones take some work or manipulation, and they're just there as a placeholder. But knowing that this exists and that things are broken up into these categories can make it a little bit easier to write expressions if you're not sure where you're coming from. Or if you're seeing an expression that somebody else wrote, you can come in here and sort of see how it's meant to be used if it's a native After Effects function. Now, I'm going to start by adding a wiggle expression from this menu. It's under property, as these things can be applied to almost every property in After Effects. I'm going to choose wiggle. You see here that it says frec, or frequency, amplitude, octaves, multiplier, and time. I don't really care. I'm just going to click it and see what happens. Now, it's inserted that expression exactly as it was in the menu into our expression field, but we're getting an error. The problem is that frequency is not defined. We know that we have to put numbers into these sections, and yet it's giving us an error because there aren't numbers. As mentioned, this is more of a template for you to work with. But frequency, we know that means how many times we want to wiggle. So we're going to say 2 times a second. We're going to say 200 pixels. For the other values here, we don't really care about them right now. So I'm just going to hit delete and click off. And now our layer is wiggling. Inversely, if you were to see this wiggle and you were curious about what do these values mean? What is 2? What is 200? If you look this up in the flyout menu, you can see that the first is frequency, the second is amplitude. And that's what we're getting here. So that snippet we had to edit. Some of them you don't, though. And some of these are really cool and things that you might not hear about otherwise. I want to show you something on a path position. So I'm going to enable expression. And you can see we have a little circle here. And from this flyout menu, I'm going to choose path property, create path. This is relatively new, so a lot of people haven't heard of it yet. But if I just click that and click off, we now have a square. Without it, it's a circle, but this expression is making a brand new path shape using the different parameters here. You can set your points, your tangents, and whether or not it's closed or open, all this stuff right within the expression. There's a lot of cool stuff that you can do now with this new path point expression, but we're not going to cover that right now, unfortunately. Now, sometimes when you're working expressions, you'll either be given an existing project with a bunch of expressions in it, or you found something online, brought it into your project, and it might be a bit hard to understand what's going on. There might be a lot of lines of code. There might be weird algebra or other archaic After Effects-y stuff, but it's very hard to know what each of the components do. In this example we have here, we have a linear expression, and linear takes these 5 parameters of what's your controller, what are you putting in, what are you getting out. Fine. The issue is, if you were just to look at this expression, you wouldn't necessarily know what the value of each of these things are. So I've written this comp.duration, which I know means the duration of the comp, but what is that number? What is the duration? There's no way to see within the context of this expression. So there's sort of a 2-phase approach to how I like to break these things out in order to figure out what the values really are. First thing I like to do to make this easier to understand is kind of separate all of these fiddly little bits inside of the linear brackets into their own variables. I'm just going to do this really quickly right now. Input is time, input minimum is 0, input maximum is this comp.duration, output minimum is 0 again, and output max is 300. Now that we have those defined, I'm just going to replace everything in here with what I just wrote. So I'm going to say input, input min, input max, output min, output max. Now what linear does in this context is says, as input goes from the min to the max, we want to output from the min to the max. So as time goes from 0 to this comp's duration, spit out a number from 0 to 300, just in a linear way. And as I scrub through my comp, you'll see that's happening. As time goes from 0 to the end, my scale is going to go from 0 to 300. Great. For me, it's so much easier to understand complicated expressions when I separate them out like this. It also makes it easier to modify the values. If I want my max to be 100% scale, not 300, I can just type it right there, and I know it's going to work without having to figure out which spot in the brackets things have to go. It's a little complicated. Now, while this does make it easier to write, I still have the issue of not knowing what the result is for some of these. I don't know what duration is. What if I said duration divided by 2? What does that number really mean? What I like to do here is take it a step further, to sort of make it even more modular, more broken down into different components by adding expression control sliders for each of these values. So in my effect controls, or with my layer, I'm going to go effect, expression controls, slider control. And I'm essentially going to redo these steps just right in here. I'm going to say input, input min, input max, output min, output max. Great. Now, if I twirl down my effects, I've got all of these. I know that my input, I want it to be time. I want my min to be 0, max to be this comp, dot duration divided by 2, output min 0, and output max, we're going to say 100. Now, the last thing here is hook them up with pick whips. And I know this is a little fiddly, but I'm breaking it down to smaller steps. If you were to write this from the beginning, you'd be working with a much deeper understanding sort of what you're writing and how it's being used. One last one. Great. So at this point, everything in the expression is hooked up to these sliders, and I can expect that these sliders are going to control everything that I'm seeing. So at this point, I can see the value of all of my components. Before, it was sort of a black box of what is time, what is this comp duration divided by 2. But by having everything on their own slider control, at every given moment of time, I can see exactly what my values are. I know that my input is time, which at this point is almost 2.5. Input min is 0, max is 2.5, and so on. This means that I can take the output max, ramp it up a little bit, and I know I'm going to start always at 15% or 54%, but it's more this way of thinking of everything that's dense and complicated inside of it, break it out. It's so much easier to see. And in recent version of After Effects, you have this ability to drag things right from the timeline into your comp panel and see the results there as well. So if you want to have an on-screen C4D style readout of your controls, you can drag this input right up here. It says slider 0 because it's a slider, and it makes a guide layer for it. If we were to look at that expression, it's going to have all the logic to hook up what this is to what we're seeing on screen. But it means you get these really simple, straightforward, on-screen displays of your values at any given time. And I can just keep dragging these out. And so everything's updating live, and you get that feedback right in there. Pretty cool. Often, when you work with expressions, especially when you're downloading snippets off the internet or you're working with other people's files and trying to modify it, you're going to see this dreaded orange bar. This bar is telling you that there's an expression error somewhere in the project. It won't tell you what the problem is, but it'll tell you where to find it. And if it can, what line it's on. Mostly just telling you, hey, there's a fire over there. You might want to go put it out. We can see that there's 2 errors, and these little buttons will go back and forth. And for each one, we get a line like this. It's going to say error at line 1 in our case, and property opacity of layer 1, and it gives you the name of it, and comp, and it gives you the name of it. So using this, we know exactly where the error is. You can click this little magnifying glass icon, and it's going to take you right there and highlight the property. Now that we know where the problem is, we still don't know what's causing it. That's where the second little icon comes in. When you see the little yield thing, you can click it, and you get this pop-up. These pop-ups are usually composed of 3 different components. The first is the same as the expression bar. It's just telling you why you're seeing this alert. It's saying that there's an error, the expression's disabled, something's wrong. The second one, it's letting you know why there's an error or what's causing this to break. The third chunk isn't always there, but when it's there, it's trying to tell you specifically what inside of your expression is causing the error. So in this case, we know where the error is, and then we see reference error, jiggle is not defined. Now, this is a bit technical, but reference error just means that After Effects doesn't know what you're referring to. You're telling it to do something called jiggle, and After Effects is confused. It's saying, we don't know what jiggle is. You didn't tell us what jiggle is. That's an error. So knowing that it's not defined, as in it's confused, I can look at my expression and figure out what to go from there. Now, if jiggle doesn't exist, I do know that there's an expression that'll jiggle my layer around, but it's called wiggle. So I'm just going to change from jiggle to wiggle, and that's resolved the error. Now my jiggle is wiggling and my wiggle is jiggling. A second really common error is this one we're going to see here. Expression result must be of dimension 2, not 1. Alternatively, it might say dimension 1, not 2, but the idea is the same thing. What this is saying is that this property that you're applying the expression to, it's looking for multiple dimensions. It wants an X and a Y, maybe a Z, but you're only giving it one thing. So if you were to give it 4, it's saying, well, is that 4X? Is that 4Y? Is it 4X and Y? What are we doing with it? We don't have enough information. So when you see this error message talking about dimensions, that's what it's referring to. It wants you to make sure that what you're feeding it matches with the expected dimensions. You'll see that the most often on things like position, anchor pointer, scale, where they all need X, Y, maybe Z. So in this case, if I look at my expression, I'm saying transform rotation. I want my scale values to be the same as my rotation values. However, rotation is just one number. It's a number of degrees. Well, that's fine for me, but it doesn't know what to do with it. The easiest kind of fix for this is to create a little temporary variable. I'm just going to say rot for rotation. And I'm going to output the same thing for both. So this says that I want my X and my Y both to be that rotation value. And now my layer disappeared. It's because my rotation is 0, and so my scale is 0. But as I rotate it, the scale is going to match my rotation for both X and Y. Alternatively, we could set one of these to maybe not 0, but a fixed number. And as my rotation changes, so too does the scale of one of the two values. Alternatively, if instead of writing this myself, I'm just going to zero this out, if I had just pick whipped rotation, After Effects knows that I'm taking a 1-dimension property and putting it on a 2-dimension property. And so it's going to actually add that exact same thing. It's going to add in setting that one value to both X and Y for me. The last thing I want to show you was this little button here for show post expression graph. If we would just look at the graph editor right now, we're going to see our two keyframes, one with rotation at 0 and the other at rotation at 100. However, I have this loop out expression that's just going to keep my animation playing after the fact, but I can't see what that looks like. If I enable this button, it's now going to show up. This dotted line up here indicates the result of the expression independent of what you have on your keyframes. This means that I can change the values of my keys, and I'm going to see what this expression resolves to right there in the graph editor. If I switch this over to ping pong, you can see that it's going up and down, and you can figure out your timing right here. You can go in and add new keys, and everything will update exactly as you'd expect if it makes sense with the expression. This is really handy for if you're working with complicated expressions to sort of see what's going on under the hood without separating things into their own variables. So I'm just going to trash all of this animation and add in something like math sine time times 2 times 100. What this is going to do is give me this nice wave here. And I know that 100 means it's going to go up 100 and down 100. But I don't know, what if I change this value? What does that do? Okay, it shrinks it down. That's great. What if I want it to be more waves? I can change time times 2 to time times 5. And it's this real-time feedback of seeing exactly what you're getting out from the expression that you put in that makes this tiny little button so valuable for expression development.
Okay, finally, I'm going to put it all together and talk about this fellow here, who I've called Handsome Harry, for obvious reasons. Now this really puts together everything we've talked about in this little lecture, including a couple of additional things, like I used the linear expression a ton, so I might have to go over that a little bit, okay? But to begin with, I just want to say that Sonder talks about using expressions to create complex rigs of things, okay? And now he doesn't do character work, but this is an example of something that I've made, which I think is a complex rig that uses a ton of expressions, okay? I just think this is a more fun thing maybe for you to play around with than like a bunch of circles moving around or something, okay? So we kind of created it like this, and let me walk you through this. I've got a ton of layers, obviously, and they're all shape layers, and then I've got a null object here, which I've made a guide layer, which I've added a ton of expression controls to, okay? See, lots of sliders, a checkbox, an angle control and stuff. All right, so let me just walk you through this real quick, what this puppet does. Okay, so I've built a faux parallax rig here, which maybe some of you have done before, but what that means is that sort of as Handsome Harry turns his head here, it really looks like he's turning in 3D space a little bit because, for example, the nose moves sort of faster and farther than the other layers that are behind it, quote unquote. It creates a kind of faux parallax, right? So this is going to work on the up and down, on the X and Y, and I've also added some additional like kind of fun things in here, like a brow curver, you know, and a brow up down, so you can make them look like angry or whatever. I have a little checkbox here, which you can check out, which adds like a little blink in here. We're giving you this After Effects project so you can kind of dig through this code and see it for yourself. And let's see, I've got an additional eye slider, which is a really fun thing to animate, I think. Up and down. And I put a little sort of smile frown kind of slider in here as well. So you can move the mouth up and down as well. So you can create like a ton of like expressions, facial expressions, not coding expressions on this puppet, okay? So like I said, mostly what I used is linear. So those I put on the position. I split the dimensions of the position so that I could move the X slider and the Y slider separately. Okay, so I have more control over it. Now, I don't have a ton of time to go over linear, but linear is pretty easy. And I think Sonder talks about it a bunch in the class. Linear, I think of as being the great translator expression, okay? So if you want to go, for example, from like rotational degrees of one layer to position of another layer or something like that. An example where you have values that are very different from one another and you kind of have to translate those values from one property to another. Linear is great for that, okay? So here, I have my X offset slider and I've made it so that this goes from -200 to 200, by the way. So that's the range, that's the min value and the max value of that slider. And I happen to know that I've calculated this, I figured this out, that when this slides all the way over to -200, I want my nose to be at the X position of 550 pixels, okay? So that's the translation here, is that the min value of the slider is -200, the max value is 200, then the min value of the nose's X position is 550, and when this slides all the way over, the max value of the nose is 1370, okay? I figured that all out mathematically, and it was a little bit of a pain because I had to figure it out so that when this was at 0, the nose was right back in the middle here, okay? So the keen observer will actually notice that 550 and 1370 are symmetrical from 960, which is the center point here. I'll let you do that math yourself, okay? But that's about it. I just used linear that way for the X and Y position of everything. And I did some other kind of fancier stuff with the ears. The ears, you'll see, kind of need to move slightly differently. And they also need to move behind the head and in front of the head. Like here, this is behind the head. And when I twirl this way, it's in front of the head. So I used if-else expressions and alternate copies of the ear so that basically like when it hits this position, it turns itself off and the other one turns itself on seamlessly, right? So it's kind of a cool rig. I think you should dig through it. I mean, I don't think this is so complex. It's not something that you'd be able to do yourself, but I think this is a fun thing. So check it all out. And I hope you have fun playing around with Handsome Harry.
Expressions are a superpower, and if you want to master them, check out Expression Session, our interactive course taught by Nol and Zack, available at School of Motion. Don't forget to grab the free project files from this video in the description below and subscribe to this channel for more motion design content. Thanks for watching.